I got it. Here we go. Welcome, everybody. This is the Fall Line with Chaos and Company. And just a shout out as we start to finish the season to our sponsors. We'll be going all summer, but I know the ski season is starting to come to a close. So we absolutely want to thank Technica Blizzard for helping us out throughout the year and being our sponsor for a second season. And hopefully we'll be able to continue that next year. And also Nick's Boot Fitting, which Nick is probably not boot fitting right now as the season ended over at Mount Snow, but over at Nick's Boot Fitting, and definitely some condolences out to the family of George Wilson, one of our family members, one of the crew that worked with Nick over at Nick's Boot Fitting. George passed away unexpectedly a week or so ago, and just thoughts and prayers with his family and friends. And also want to thank Rollerblade for helping us out, and hopefully we get to do some things with Miles Cotter Sparrow this summer and fall, and get out there on the rollerblades and get ready for next season. But we're still talking about this season, and we're pretty excited tonight, Angelo. We have Ann Schorling, one of our PSIA-AASI team members. Is this your third term, Ann? Second term. Second term, just back from Interski and National Academy, a big month. And we wanted to have Ann on to chat about some stuff. We wanted Ann on for a while, and she was definitely busy last spring when we were thinking about it. So we didn't get to do that. But Ann, thanks for coming on with us, man. We're psyched for tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Angelo, what's going on, brother? You're back from about a month of chaos.
Yeah, I had about 3.5 weeks of travel, Interski. Just got back from National Academy, and then between those did a week's worth of training new bicycle tour guides for the company I work for in the summer, and settling in and switching gears to spring right now.
Yeah. So I want to compare hours of travel to Interski, because I know you had a fun time getting there, Angela, and getting back. What was it, 39 hours getting there for you?
It was about 38 to get there, yeah.
And it was about probably another 6 days, or was it 5 days for your equipment to arrive?
Yeah. I got there. Yeah. Well, my flights kept changing. I know that happened to a lot of people. I had about a 3.5 hour drive to the airport to kick it off. And then I pulled into the parking lot at BWI, and I hadn't even turned my truck off, and I got a text that said your flight is delayed. And when I looked at the amount of time, I knew I was going to miss my connection in Heathrow. Yeah. So it's just like this domino effect. But I got to Levy at about 9:30 a.m., maybe 10 a.m. on Saturday morning, and my skis arrived sometime on Thursday.
So Ann, was your travel arrangements and to get there that difficult too, or
no? All of our flights were on time. All of our stuff arrived with us on both legs. I traveled with a 7-month-old baby, and it was way easier than Angelo's travel.
Angela, you need a different travel agent, man. You're gonna, next time if you're going out and it's somewhere crazy, you need to get a hold of Ann and figure out what they use, because man, it was. Yeah. Did you book the flights, Angela, or was it Amanda?
Amanda booked them. It was like Expedia. I used Expedia, but it worked every other time.
Yeah, it worked every other time.
Just this time.
Expedia is great as long as it goes right.
As long as it works. Right. Yeah. Didn't work.
So how was the travel with the 7-month-old? How was that in the week at Interski? Was that crazy?
Speaking specifically to the 7-month-old part.
Yeah.
It was shockingly easy. She's a champion traveler. She, shockingly easy. And my husband came along, and he was primary parent, and my parents were there because they're diehard ski instructors and Interski fans. And then they were also grandparenting. So with lots of support, it was shockingly easy. She's
that's cool.
Good traveler, generally baseline happy.
Well, so by the next Interski, the little one should be on skis ripping.
That would be awesome. Yeah, if she wants to, you might be a snowboarder. Who knows?
Yeah. I don't know. Could be.
She's cheerleading, and then we'll have to talk. But
that's cool. So speaking of skiing, I mean, that's the one question. The first time we've had you on the podcast, and we say that because hopefully we'll have you again. We always want to, even before we start, like to invite you back. But I'm super curious about how you started skiing and what your first experience was. And do you remember being on skis the first time?
I don't remember being on skis the first time. Even though I'm from Pennsylvania, I grew up skiing in Colorado. My parents taught skiing part-time at Keystone in Colorado ever since they started when I was 5, but we started going out there to ski when I was like 2 and 3. So I don't remember it, but we'd go basically for 6 weeks every year, and they would pull us out of school. And then they worked out a deal that you could never do anymore, where they traded for every 2 hours, one of them taught, one of the 3 of us went to ski school for free.
Oh.
And so I basically spent 6 weeks every year in Keystone Ski School.
Cool. And when did you start teaching skiing yourself?
I started my first year out of college.
Oh.
I had no intention, was definitively not going to be a ski instructor. Was not my goal, but I needed a pass, because I was raised with an abnormal expectation for the number of days on snow I could get every year. And the only way to do that is if you teach. So I started teaching first year out of college.
So were you just skiing? Was there any competitive part or racing or anything else? Just skiing?
No.
Just ripping?
I always wanted actually to be like a bumps competitor freestyle. But because we were out in these chunks, we could never do any of the seasonal programs. And then because we were gone for chunks, we couldn't do the seasonal programs when we were in Pennsylvania either.
Yeah.
So no competition.
And I think I had heard this before, but it didn't really register. And then when I was kind of getting ready for the podcast, I'm like, Telly. I didn't know Ann was Telly. Then I'm looking into it, and then Ann's not just like a little Telly. She's level 3. You're on the ed staff out there in your region. And so when did you start Telly skiing?
I started Telly skiing when I was 17. My sister and I, my sister took a telemark class. She's 2 years older than me, her freshman year in college, and really liked it. And one of my parents' closest friends is Patty Banks, who was the Nordic chair in Rocky Mountain for a long time. And so we recruited Patty to teach us how to telemark. So I started taking telemark lessons when I was 17 from Patty. And then when I was in college, I wound up teaching telemarking 3 years later. A little bit, and that was it.
So when you were going through the certifications, did you do both at the same time? Did you roll through one, then the other, or?
I started going through Alpine certifications in my first couple of years. And then I tore my ACL, and I was like, I'm out. I don't want to do this anymore. Don't want to teach skiing. Took a year traveling, came back. Lo and behold, I was now in Victor, Idaho. I still needed a pass. So I taught skiing at Targhee, but only telemark. I only wanted to telemark because it seemed like less likely to injure my knee, which I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was my perception. So then I started going through my telemark certs. And so ultimately, in every cert, I got my telemark cert before I got my Alpine cert, except for level 1s.
Yeah. Cool. So as you went into the ed staff, was it Telly first? Was it Alpine?
Telly first. Telly was, I'm not going to remember the years. Telly ed staff might have been 2011.
Yeah.
And Alpine ed staff, they might have been one after the other.
Yeah.
2 years apart. Can't remember.
Yeah. So I know you're still involved with both from what I hear, but how involved? I mean, obviously with the Alpine being the Alpine part of the team is pretty involved, but I mean, how much time do you spend on Telly, coaching Telly, and with the Telly ed staff?
Since I made the Alpine team, I haven't spent very much time on Tellys, just one too many commitments. So I've stepped back quite a bit from that.
Yeah. And is that because of the travel, being away from the home hill?
Yeah, travel, being away from the home hill. There's not that much telemark work in our region.
Yeah.
So, and there are other people that want to do it, and just feeling like, yeah, I do, to your point about being away from the home hill, I really value having a home base, having a community in the locker room. I value the experience of folks dropping by my locker and talking about what they're working on or their ski projects. And so, yeah, I don't want to travel that much.
Yeah. Because I find with doing the Alpine gig here in the East, not being on both ed staffs for telly, that if I'm away from the home mountain, there's no way to telly because it's like I'm on the Alpine gear all day and it's like I can't put it on. But if I'm at the home hill in the afternoon, if I get a couple hours, I'm just going skiing with the staff, I can put my telly gear on. But when I'm not at the home hill very often, not a lot of time to put my telly gear on. So Angelo's finding that out when he's traveling because he's coming up through the ranks in the telly. He got his level 1.
I did.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Level 2 was on my radar, and then I got called to work this year. So, that happens quite a bit.
Does happen.
Yeah.
It's on next year's radar, though, isn't it?
Right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk about the versatility. Did you feel the telly and Alpine has been an advantage for you versatility-wise, movement-wise in your skiing?
I think it was an advantage up to a certain point, movement-wise, in terms of just finding balance. I think it was a big advantage in terms of understanding ski performance, because so many of the things we talk about in the telly world are actually the same in the Alpine world. And I think I understood them first in telly. And so being able to cross over and think in two disciplines helped me really clarify kind of what's the same and what's different. So that was a huge advantage. And I think with anything, when you start specializing and getting up towards the really high levels, it can be for team tryouts, for example, it wasn't helpful for me to try to cross over because the movement patterns, it's easier actually to cross from Alpine to telly than it is for me to go back from telly to Alpine. For movement patterns, I get a little more screwed up that way.
Yeah. So I was sitting here in the East Coast while you guys and crew were all over in Finland, and I definitely was in the greenhouses, and I was listening. I was watching Instagram, Facebook, and yes, as I found out chatting with you before we got on the podcast, you didn't know it was live streamed, and a lot of us here, I know I was watching your presentation live streamed on there, and it was really cool to have all that. And I really want to get into that first. I like to keep the podcast kind of linear fashion, time wise, but I want to go to your presentation at Interski because I don't want to miss it. This is why I wanted to have you on this week. And it was great. I mean, from sitting here at home watching it, I thought one of the best presentations. It was the best to me in terms of anything I've seen on gender equality, for diversity, that stuff, because you had your research from your grad work that really went to real things that were going on in a real ski school. And I just thought it was really neat to see real things. You had real data. You had so much stuff in that. But for those that didn't listen, can you just give a little bit about what your presentation was? So, because I know you can explain it better than I can, just what your presentation was and what you were going to present to Interski.
Sure. So my master's research was on increasing gender equity in snow sports instruction. And the interest came to me as I watched the progression towards the 2020 and ultimately 2021 tryouts, and just watched the endorsement process and how basically how skewed the group was in terms of the ratio of men to women who showed up to, who were even invited to go to tryouts. And so I started kind of noodling this idea for a while. And then in my master's was able to choose a research project with the goal of trying to actually affect change. So I worked with Big Sky Mountain Sports School and their VP of Mountain Sports, Christine Baker, to develop a process to help their school change. And so the research that I presented at Interski was basically the findings at Big Sky and a couple of the key problems and how they relate to the broader world. So one of those problems, it has to do with our gender expectations, which is we all have expectations of people based on their gender. It's kind of the first way we identify people. And we assume that women are empathic, and we assume that men are decisive and technically competent. And that matters for us in snow sports instruction because it has a lot to do with how we assign lessons and how clients request instructors. And the outcome is that people who identify as women wind up teaching more emotionally challenging lessons, and people who identify as men wind up teaching more technically or physically challenging lessons, which is in general fine, right? Neither of those is better or worse than the other. The problem is that our certification process lends itself more towards physically demanding lessons. And so part of our population is more likely to get lessons that will help them train for certification, versus like people who identify as women are more likely to have to take a day off to train for certification because they're not getting that training through work. So that's one of the two pieces. And the other has to do with basically the slice of the pie. So the ratio of a minoritized group in a population. And when you get a really skewed group, so less than 30%, you start to see a number of behaviors show up and have impacts on that population. And they can basically, when you have a group that's got a small enough minority, you start to see their performance drop, or you start to see them have evidence of a stereotype threat. And those can have impacts on their performance in an assessment, starts to have impact on their engagement in the group, their excitement about developing. And it also affects the community within the minority, depending on how small that slice of the pie is. So I kind of broke that out, and it's a little tougher to do in a soundbite, but basically, a huge piece of that is when we think about the slices of pies of women who are on alpine gear versus snowboard gear, and who's in that slice of pie. And in general, snowboarding populations tend to be much smaller in our schools. And so they often have fewer role models and less of a community. And so they tend to have to sort of go it alone, versus alpiners can benefit from learning in a group of women because they have peers and role models.
Yeah, the minority part really interests me because it was, you spoke in your presentation that sometimes the way we build our groups, that we try to make sure there's like at least two women, but we don't like put a whole group of women together. And you're talking about that and you know, and I think you'd said some things that maybe we need to rethink that so that they're not a minority in each group, which was some neat. And also I had a kind of a question. Like, I'm sitting at home, I'm in the greenhouse, I wanted to ask a question, and, you know, the stuff came up, you know, people are asking questions. They're like, they're not asking the question I want to ask. And the question is, can we, and in general, you know, Angelo and I here tend to always be, not always, but pretty close to it. People say you're always in the majority, you know, when we go to most of our events. When I'm in most of my groups, yes, I am in the majority. So, but is there a way that the majority can help some of the minority, the females in this case, feel more like they're not in the minority, like that they're part of the team? Is that possible?
That's such a good question. I don't know of any research when you get actually, like, for example, in a small group in an assessment, right? When you have a minority that is smaller than 30%. I do think that there are pieces of advocacy, or like, there are ways that you could support that person's performance or their mental state, like letting them know when they do something really effectively, cheering for them, being an advocate or an ally, making sure they're set up and they're getting their needs met, because that person is going to be less likely to speak up for what they need. So those are ways that you can help the minority feel like a majority.
Because we've been discussing these kind of things on and off the podcast, Angelo. And so I know she's shaking his head there. I don't know if he has anything he wants to.
Well, yeah, I first of all just want to say to anybody who's listening who hasn't seen Anne's presentation, you can Google or go on YouTube and just enter Anne Schorling, Schorling. And when I did it, it was the first thing that popped up. So if you haven't seen Anne's presentation, it is absolutely worthwhile. Check it out. But yeah, we have had these conversations, not so much on the show, but off, I think. But because if you look at the ed staff in the East, you know, it's one of the things that jumps out to me about the ed staff in the Eastern U.S. is that it is predominantly men. But if you look at the leadership, it's predominantly women. And I've always found that interesting. And Amanda's like, yeah, because you guys need den mothers because you can't take care of yourselves. Like that, you know, which is funny and probably because it's mostly true. But like, that always struck me we always say in the room, like when you're in the room, it's largely men, but the leadership, the people who speak are mostly women. And I think that's notable. I don't know why it's that way, but it's interesting.
I wonder if there's also patterns in sports school leadership where like often supervisors, managers, and even directors, there's a higher percentage of women in those roles than there are, say, at a level 3 certification. So I wonder if that somehow mirrors it.
It could. And as I think about it, like if you look at the ski patrols where I work, we're kind of a unique setup because we're 3 different resorts, but 2 of them are considered base areas to Seven Springs. So Hidden Valley Resort and Laurel Mountain Resort are considered base areas, even though they're miles away from the mothership. But if you just look at if you look at the snow sports school, so our senior manager is a woman, and one of the supervisors at one of the resorts is a woman. So it's 50-50 in the snow sports school. But if you look at the patrols, the senior manager is male, identifies male, and is male. And all 3 managers at the patrols at the resorts are female, who identify as female. So it's there's a large female representation in leadership in the on-snow pros at our resorts. But I think if you look at the ranks, again, it's largely men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, last year at the dev team tryout was the first time I think ever. I mean, from everyone telling me, we had 12 people make it and 8 were women. And it was also one of the first dev teams we had I don't want to say big group, but we had more numbers than we've had in the past of women come to the tryout finally. And I hope more come. I mean, I think that's part of your message. You got to show up, you got to go to make these things. And that's kind of my thing. How do we encourage them? Like next year, there's going to be a development team, which is the entry level for our Alpine Ed staff next season. And I want them to show up because they didn't show up at our Eastern team tryout. We had 2 women show up out of 20 and neither one was able to make it. So we have no women on our Eastern team, but we only had 2. We had 10%, less than that, or 10%. Yeah. I mean, how do we move past that to try to at least help advocate to get them to show up? Is there a way? I'm asking because I don't know.
I mean, this is, basically, you're going to wind up having in the Eastern Division region, you're going to wind up having questions about like, what's the pipeline like to get those folks there? In general, even once you get to the pipeline, on average, this is not true of all individuals, but on average, what I have heard is that more women say, oh, I just don't feel like I'm quite ready, so I'm going to wait. Versus men are more likely to just try. And so that's part of the puzzle. And then the other piece is, why are there so few who are even in the pool to like consider going? Mm-hmm. And so that's a question for like looking at the processes in the East or like schools. And we can't speak to that necessarily. Right. But I do think it goes a long way to tell someone, hey, I know you don't feel like you're ready. I think you should just go and try it. Yeah. Even just those words make a big difference.
Yeah, because you had mentioned at the end of your talk, I think 2 of your coaches were both male, and the wording you used, they were advocates for you, and they were male, they weren't female, to do the talk and bring your research work to Interski and give that presentation. So that's kind of why I asked that. It's like, I think the guys need to do that more. Personally, I think we need to make sure we do that. And that's obviously from your perspective, I think that helps. Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from my personal experience, Jeb Boyd, Michael Rogan, Nick Heron, Dave Schorling all called me and talked to me about the possibility of doing the keynote. They sent me the form I needed to fill out. They coached me when I had questions on how to fill out the form. They got it to the board, which had Eric Shackleton and Pete Allison on it, who I suspect were also advocates for me giving the keynote. And so that's 6 men that were all involved in making the process for me to get from having finished my master's to the place where I was on the keynote stage, because it would not have ever crossed my mind to try to apply for a keynote. I wouldn't have even known that the process existed to apply to be a keynote. So I think basically helping people recognize the pathway and that it's there and showing it to them. And the more obstacles we can help get out of the way, I think the more likely it is for someone who's maybe not totally overly confident will wind up in that spot.
Yeah. And I want to know what you think of this. And so, we could edit it out afterwards if you don't like this question, but after like this experience for you and people, should we encourage people to come to the tryout when they don't really think they're ready? How do we get some of the ladies to say, well, I'm not ready? And you're like, well, you need to go anyways, like the guys do. Because when do you know you're ready? I mean, I didn't know if I was ready. I had to go find out. So it's kind of that guy's mentality. I went and tried. But how do we get the women to have that mentality? Can we? Is it possible?
I don't know if it's possible to change the mentality, but it is possible to encourage them or help them feel more ready, or, identify earlier in the process. Like, hey, these are people, if we can identify those folks 2 or 3 years out and start thinking forward and thinking about, okay, what are these folks going to need? And like a little bit more lasting mentorship can be really helpful.
Yeah.
There's not a right answer, right? It's always going to be different.
I want the right answer though, Ann.
I know. Tell me how to do it. Tell me the steps A, B, and C. It's going to be a little different every time.
Well, I mean, because, I'm in the role right now, the development team coach, which is in our Alpine world. And that's the group that comes in that's looking, they're on a 4-year term. And that's where we pull up, that's the pool that goes in to be our examiners, that a lot of the other regions aren't calling assessors, but our examiners. And that pool is still mostly men, so I need to, and our region definitely needs to figure out how to get more women, as you say, in the pipeline and get them there. So a lot of what I hear is we need to outreach and advocate more for those we see, those diamonds in the rough that might not think they are. We need to advocate, and I don't want to say push. I think we need to encourage more. It's probably more what you would say, encourage and kind of help out to get that confidence. Is that how you would term it?
Yeah. And I, like just thinking at the moment, there are kind of 2 things that come to mind that would be places to look at, right? Which is, what is the criteria to leave the dev team? And could there be people who would leave the dev team? Like, where's the standard? And is there a way that the standard could be that there are folks who wouldn't quite meet the standard, but would be effective members of the ed staff in specific roles? So then you can get those folks into a working role and continue to develop them. So that's one way to look at it. A second thought, thinking about like the Eastern team is a fascinating team because y'all are, as far as I know, the only region where people get funding to go to national team selections. And some of the language around trying out for the Eastern team is like, you have to know, you can't just test the waters because we're going to fund you. So you're going to have this money. So if you don't know that you want to go to tryouts nationally, don't go to the Eastern team selection. So I think people who are still kind of on the fence, not totally sure, might step back and say, well, I don't want to take the spot from someone else, so I'm just not going to go. So thinking about, okay, how does actually funding, which is this amazing gift, does that affect people's willingness to try out? I've heard from a couple folks like, oh, I didn't, I just wasn't positive that this is what I wanted, so I didn't go. So those are 2 systems places to look that could potentially have an impact in addition to encouraging people, because it's usually, there's usually a combo in terms of what's the outcome that's happening.
Yeah. So you never thought you'd do a presentation at the keynote, at Interski. So, I mean, when I was watching that, it was the only keynote, and they stated it when I was watching it, that the only keynote that got a standing ovation. And I saw that standing ovation with the camera and that. It also was said that it had the biggest audience of all the keynotes. And so has that changed your view for you to maybe when some other things come along, you might be more inclined to do them like a presentation? You might think about it without someone advocating, or is it still, you're not sure?
That's a great question. I think my radar about presentations is not something I necessarily look for, Yeah. And part of that is because presenting is a ton of work. Like the number of hours that I put into that keynote and the number of times that I stood alone in the tuning room in Finland talking to the wall after dark to just run through that keynote so it went the way that it did. It's just a lot of work, a lot of mental energy. And so I feel like I feel very proud of the work that I did, and it would have to be something I really wanted to do to present again, because I would want it to go similarly.
Because I think the presentation you gave, and as Angelo said, it's up for people to go watch, and they should. I know I'm going to be pushing it all next fall. I think that the directors, I think it should be, I would have loved to have seen you come. Maybe they will invite you to come to our Eastern snow sports management. Because so much of this is grassroots. It's changing the pipeline that starts right at the resorts, from them hiring and bringing people in. I mean, there's not much place we go other than the resorts in our region to find our members. And that's where we need to increase that pipeline. And you had so much great stuff that was simple stuff that I've seen for years and stood at lineup and go, man, that wasn't a very fair assignment right there. I mean, you see it all the time. I mean, to be simple, the women get stuck with every low-level kid lesson first before any of the guys. I mean, and if anybody out there says different, they're lying to themselves. And you see it every day. It's the truth. And I've seen for years that, guys will get a lesson, and a kid, they don't like teaching the kids, and they'll come back, they'll talk to parents and say, you should really ask for a female. They do really well with the females. It does happen. And your research work really looked at that and not getting opportunities to teach certain lessons. And can you tell the listeners a little bit about that and the data on it? I mean, you had it from Big Sky.
The data. So the work that I did with Big Sky, what's fascinating about this is the work that I did with Big Sky was specific to their school. So my goal was to help them facilitate changes and come up with systems changes that would help develop, basically help improve gender ratios at higher levels. And when you do research like that, it's like the transferability of it can be limited, because I'm looking at this small school, right? I'm working with a subset of their population. There were fewer than 100 instructors that participated in this research. So I'm looking at a really small pool. And then what's fascinating about it is every time I've mentioned this pattern, which was it was just all over the data in the stories that people told about their experiences. One woman said, if I get one more lesson that says patient female requested, I'm going to lose my shit. And that theme is just repeated. You could see it over and over and over again. And so what's has been fascinating for me, has been when I share that, no one has ever said, oh, no, that doesn't happen where I work. So they come to me with a story. So I've got stories from Europe. I've got stories from other resorts across the US, East, West, Central, doesn't matter. Everyone's got a story. And that theme, the data is really specific to Big Sky. And yet the theme seems to resonate everywhere. I've not heard anyone that really counters it.
Yeah. And other than that simple stuff, you even had some stuff you worked with Big Sky and how to use the folks that are taking reservations and where customers have that mentality to ask for certain things. You had some info or some I don't want to say guidelines, but had some answers to try to change the way they talk to customers.
Yeah. So I'll back up a second, which is that gender bias or those assumptions of, women having emotional skills and men having physical skills. We all have them. I have them. You have them. They're deeply rooted. And the sources of the impact on instructors come from supervisors, right? Because they're the ones assigning the lessons. They come from co-instructors. You mentioned, the example of a male instructor who doesn't want to ski with a kid anymore, suggesting they look for a female identified instructor. And then the biggest hit me over the head surprise was, oh yeah, it comes from clients too. And that one of the supervisors in Big Sky said, if 6 people call in and request female identified instructors to ski with their 3-year-olds, I don't have any women to send up on our double black diamond guide lessons. Even if I have instructors who are qualified, they're already booked, because we as resorts are in the service industry and we tend to honor client requests that are reasonable because the client comes first, and the impact on our ability to develop staff is significant. So what Big Sky decided to do, sorry, crying baby in the background. What Big Sky decided to do is create a script for their sales staff so that they could interrupt that gender bias of guests and basically have more choice and influence over what instructors do. And they wrote a script that sounds something like, we can't guarantee the gender of our instructors. Can you talk to us about what skills you're hoping your instructor will have? And then when they take notes on the lesson, they write notes about the skills the client is requesting in the instructor instead of the gender, so that when the supervisors get that request, they're no longer looking at a binary divide where they're choosing either someone who identifies as a man or someone who identifies as a woman. Instead, they can choose from their whole population of instructors looking for this specific skill set.
Yeah. There you go, Angelo. Something to add to your training repertoire.
Well, I think that's huge, because it requires a little bit more effort on the part of the resort. And I understand the logic behind the customer's always right and the whole customer service thing, but you could also use that as a kind of a lazy shield, and oh, they asked for this, so we just filled the hole. But if you fill the holes and you run out of I'm thinking you're talking about Big Sky, and I'm picturing like, if I go ski blacks, I want to ski with Zoe or Brenna, but if they're tied up with a 3-year-old, I don't get to ski with them. And it just requires a little bit more effort on the part of the resort to understand who their staff is, and spend a little bit more time carefully training the people who are accepting the phone calls and then assigning the lessons. And it's a chunk of work, but like ultimately it's going to pay off for the better,
From talking to Christine, it sounds like they didn't have a lot of pushback from guests or supervisors. Supervisors didn't express that it was very difficult to have this conversation with folks. At group lessons, they would say, sorry, our instructor's already assigned to levels, so we can't influence that. Or doesn't sound like they had much trouble when people made lesson requests with a gender request. So at least we have some information that it didn't create difficulty on the part of the supervisors or the sales staff answering the phone.
I was thinking about, a couple of moments ago, like my experience as an early instructor, and of course all the young instructors and all the women are kind of pigeonholed to the kids' lessons. And that's just what we saw. But like as a teenage instructor, like as a male teenage instructor, for me, there was light at the end of the tunnel if I chose it, because I knew if I got better, if I got certified, if I could ski bumps, like I could escape the junior ski ranks. And I'm wondering if the women, the girls that I got hired with felt that, or if they even saw that as an option, or if that was just kind of a male thing. It was, it was the 90s, but like, I knew that if I got better, I wouldn't have to do that anymore, and that kind of played out to be true. But I look at some of the people I got hired with, and that was, 30 some years ago, and they're still teaching kids with, and maybe some of them want to, but I don't know if they ever had the option to not do it.
What was really mind blowing for me was talking to Lynn Mill from the British team, and her mentioning that BASI level 4s who teach in France often have a hard time maintaining their skill set because they don't get lessons that are high level, off-piste, advanced lessons. And that for me, I had always thought of it as part of the building up trajectory. I'd never thought of it as, oh, it doesn't actually matter what your certification is. You're still going to get the same lesson, and that it could actually decrease people's skill set. Yeah. Mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So someone after the presentation brought up I think he said it was a comment, not a question, but it was kind of put out there to the Interski to like have 50-50 at the next Interski, 50% women, 50% men on each team. And here's a guy going, why should all the women limit it to 50%? Why couldn't the next team have 70% women if we have them? I mean, would we really want to do that? I mean, if 70% that go to the tryout that are going to be our Interski team, say from the USA, and the 70% is women, why shouldn't it be? It has been for men the other way. Is that like, I mean, we shouldn't go. I don't think 50-50 is the way to go. I'm wondering what you thought. You didn't really answer that question because he wasn't asking a question, or that I remember. But I mean, what are your thoughts now? I mean, do you want to answer that? I mean, who says all the women? It could be a whole women's team.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. Really, what he's talking about is a quota, right? Where you decide proportions. So like Canada, for example, had a quota, and their quota was less than 50-50. It was like a third female identified. So then it's like, well, yeah, that's limiting the population of women that could show up. And anytime you have a quota, that's part of what it's doing. The flip side of that being a country like England or PSIA, where they set a quota that was going to be 50-50. And they wound up having 40 people who identify as men apply and 3 women. And so they wound up having to like find a 4th woman, and they found someone who's totally qualified. If you watch the PSIA on snow demos, like I couldn't tell the women from the men. They all looked the same to me. They were 8 people skiing really well together. And so in that case, the quota increased the representation of women on the team. And when you have role models, you're more likely to have other women see that it's a possibility. So there's that standpoint. And one of the Swiss snowboarders came up to me in the airport and gave me this thought, which I have still been turning over in my head. And she said, if you have 2 jobs and one job has 40 applicants for that job, and the other job has 3 applicants, we can assume that the second job is way harder than the first job, or that it is way harder to get qualified for the second job. And so if you choose only one person for each of those jobs, we cannot assume the person for the second job is less qualified or has worked less hard just because the population was smaller. And in fact, we could probably assume that they're more qualified because fewer people were even able or interested to apply. And that has exploded my head in my way of thinking. And I don't have an answer. I don't know what is the right answer. I think there are a number of different arguments. In general, I'm for affirmative actions type stances, right? If you have a minoritized group and a dominant group and they perform the same, I think every time we should choose the minoritized group. Or if they're even close, right? I think there's a good reason to have more representation on our teams, which is different than a quota.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I feel about quotas. There you go.
Yeah. No, I think it is, because it's like, it's in some cases it helps, in some cases it might detract. It's like to set, there's pros and cons to either way, depending on the situation of the country or the team that's being picked, the jobs. Yeah, I mean, it's like elevations. We're looking at, because we get hit, and not saying it's a bad thing we get hit, but, we had it in social media of like, come on, Eastern region, do better. And it's like, we wanted to do better. I know being one of the scorers, we wanted to do better, but it's hard when, and like you said, there was people that saw the wording of the way the Eastern was, and some didn't come because of that, both male and female. And then, so that definitely looking at how we set that up to try to get more representation. It didn't affect Angelo. He was there.
I think the endorsement piece is fascinating because, again, it's like really the end of the pipeline. there's only so much we can do when we get to a selection. There are things we can do, and there's only so much we can do once we've got there. The problems are, if you only have 10%, was it 2 out of 20? You said 10%.
Yeah, it was 2 out. We had 2 out of 20.
You're like, there's a problem farther down the pipeline, and there are places where the net is catching more people than we want. So it's like there's only so much you can do when you've got 10%. For the group for women.
And it's whatever. I mean, you've already mentioned a bunch of things, but is there a couple of things that you kind of see, and maybe it's from your data from your research, or maybe it's as you see, and like you did a little, you said that in your presentation too, was only a small sampling, but it's interesting how the things that you hear that really support that across the world. Are there some things that ski schools can do that are kind of simple beyond what we've already talked about here that maybe you did talk about in your presentation, or maybe just some thoughts you have, like if we can do more of this at the ski and snowboard school level, it'll start to help the pipeline. Is there anything Ann has? It's like, I think this might help.
I think at the ski and snowboard level, some of this is going to be relevant to everybody, some of it not. I think one thing that Big Sky started doing, certainly with their Alpine instructors, is creating affinity trainings for their high level training, which is where, again, that slice of the pie starts to get smaller and smaller. So as you're looking at level 3 training, guide training, there's a smaller and smaller population of people who are capable of doing that. And so that's a place where you're more likely to have a skewed group in a training, where you might have one woman out of a group of 8. And it's going to affect generally her experience negatively. And so they started creating affinity trainings, like for guides, for example, and they don't only have affinity trainings, but what they found is that some women attend the affinity trainings for guide training. So they've got a female trainer, all female participants, and then some of those participants then felt confident enough after 1 or 2 of them to attend regular guide training. And it just gave them enough of a skills boost that they then felt confident in that really skewed group. So creating trainings where we have similarly leveled participants and we can have an affinity group can be really helpful in places where we don't have that population. So in the snowboard school at Big Sky, thinking about mentorship strategies and how you can even pair male mentors with female instructors so that they've got someone who's paying attention to their pathway, advocating for them, helping them kind of navigate the waters. So it can be more of a group situation when you have a big enough minority versus sometimes it kind of has to become individualized. Yeah. Those are a couple of things.
Angelo's chewing on something.
No, one of the hardest things to do is just to question your assumptions, and like you don't even realize they are assumptions. But if at the management level and down into the supervisory level on most snow sports schools, if they just, made it easy for the young female instructors to go out and get a bump clinic with one of the experienced instructors on staff, like just encourage it, and that's how I got into it. But I didn't have the same barriers to entry that maybe when I was 18-year-old new instructor, I didn't have the same barriers that an 18-year-old female instructor had. So you have to recognize it first. And I think your work, Ann, goes a long way to you shed light on it for sure. I mean, your data sheds light on it. I guess one of the questions I was going to save till the end, but maybe I'll just throw it out there now, is what's next? What do you do next with this? Where do you take it? Because it sounds like we're at a point in the conversation where, and I have to believe, just being involved in the industry, that most managers at most snow sports schools would just totally agree with what you're saying. But a couple of minutes ago, it was like, okay, well, we need them. We're a microscopic portion of a much larger population, a much larger issue. So your work has to go up and down the chain. Like, instructors need to know about it, but management needs to know about it too. So, like, how does that happen? Is there a plan for that? Like, I know you from we're on a task force together, and I got to ski with you last year at 2022 Academy. And I want to put this out there because last year when we skied together at Academy, I thought it was a pretty heavy group. Like it was a pretty good group of skiers, and we rolled up the Ram Charger lift first, and we're just kind of doing a little circle ski early on Monday morning. And I'm watching these guys ski down that I've been watching for years, but Bob Shostak and Billy Bierman, and these guys are fantastic skiers. And then we watched Ann come down, and we were like, holy shit. Like, that's why she's in front of the group. Like, she rips, Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there. But like, where does this work go from here? Because like I said, I think most snow sports people would agree that, like, yeah, this needs to be addressed. But we could probably use some support from upstairs, right? So how does that happen?
The thing about what I did at Big Sky that is very specific to how they were able to come up with solutions is I created a storytelling scenario where if you came in and you identify as a man, I gave you a script. I talk about it in the presentation. And they basically spend an hour asking these questions and asking people who identify as women to tell stories. And then once they had spent time listening to the stories and actually hearing the impact of the experiences on the women in the room, then the entire group did some problem solving. And it enabled them to have what I call proximity to the experiences of women, so they could empathize a little bit more easily and then knew where to try to make the change. And then that group designed the changes in Big Sky. And a couple of pieces of that are important. One is that it enabled the men to better understand what's going on. And so I think helped them towards being advocates for the women in their community because they understand what it looks like and how it affects them. And it's really hard for us to counter our implicit bias day in and day out. It's born into us. It's almost impossible to do. And so what that group came up with are systems changes for how they operate in their school. One of them being that script for sales. Another one being that they track lesson assignments so that they can actually see whether someone is systematically getting lower level lessons. And then those system changes help them organizationally challenge bias when it's really challenging as individuals. And I think my personal belief is that coming at it from both sides is really helpful because individual advocates are so effective, and having a system that supports minoritized groups is also really important. So, what we did in Jackson, I did not do this research in my home resort at Jackson, but what we did is when I came back from Interski, we sat down with all the supervisors. They all watched the presentation, and then I ran them through a similar process where they told stories and were listening to each other and figuring out what it looks like in Jackson, and then started to come up with solutions for us. So a piece of that is personalizing it. What is actually happening in your resort? And then I think that can be done either in a group setting set up by the organization or as an individual. Like, let's say you can find the questions in my thesis. I share them in the presentation. But as an individual, you can talk to your friends in any minoritized group and ask them about their personal experiences and to tell you a story. And just the process of listening to that story will help you understand what it looks like and what it feels like in their shoes and help us be better advocates. And I can do that also. Like there were women who asked the questions as well. And just understanding the stories. So that's one piece. A second piece that my research, and I think this is harder actually, but that my research kind of barely touched on, right? Because it was through storytelling that the problems were unearthed. And because I was asking people to be really vulnerable, that meant that the very personal stories of harassment or of kind of extreme offense, those stories didn't really come out. There were I heard a couple stories, but my research didn't access those very effectively. And I think figuring out ways to help the stories that did come out, let me back up. The stories that did come out, the offense was less frustrating than the trainers. Usually they were in trainings, than the trainers' inability to appropriately handle it and recognize the impact it was having on members of the group. So to me, there's a piece of how can we train ourselves to see it and understand it and the impact that it's having. Like, here's an example from my personal life that I'll just share because I was working at a resort and I've worked at a few, so I won't name it. I was in a uniform. I was pretty new. I was at the top of the chairlift and I was buckling my boots. And another instructor came up and said, "Hey, nice ass. Thanks for buckling your boots there in uniform." And right, that's like, it happened. He was in a uniform. I was in a uniform. This is my experience. And those are the kinds of stories where if someone else sees it, helping other people to be able to see it and say something. And I think that is a big leap for us as a culture. And as individuals, it's just hard. You know, in that moment, I drew a complete blank. I can tell you exactly what I would say now, but I sure couldn't come up with a thing then.
Would you say anything or just smack him with your pole?
Yeah.
Stab him, maybe.
Yeah, right. But I think that's kind of the first frontier is can we do the simple things? Can we handle can we work on gender equity in lesson assignments? Can we handle those things that came out that feel like we can all agree that they happen and that and they're less weighted? And then the next piece is how do we support our advocates, the people who want to be allies, the people who are, bystanders? How do we support folks to be able to say something and take that leap? And I think I don't have the answer, but
I'm thinking of the people skills stuff, and we talk about managing our own behavior and we talk about influencing other people and effective two-way communication. And I'm assuming that fella didn't earn your trust that day. Right.
He broke trust.
No, but Ann and I are on the people skills task force together and worked on some of those learning outcomes and the the assessments and things like that. But one of the conversations we had throughout that was like a thread that ran through. Is like, well, what's next on that? Because this obviously runs deeper than, lifting your goggles up so somebody can see your eyes when you meet them for the lesson. Like, what happens not just in a lesson when somebody chooses that behavior, but like we're talking about, this is not stuff that's just limited to when you're teaching a ski lesson. This is like how you live your life and like, how do you react to that? And, so there's a lot of work to be done in the people skills stuff because, the lifting the goggles up is pretty low hanging fruit when it comes to like what actually happens, when you're out and about. So yeah, I mean, there's opportunity anyway.
Yeah, and that would have been, if I kept my linear progression, I like Angelo, I like that linear progression, that we would have talked about the people skills task force, because I know you were you were the leader, the chairperson. What did they of the people skills task force? I don't know what they called the lead person on that.
Manager, I think.
I know that we had titles, but
we called her the Overlord because it was like, it's on, man. This needs to be done. Schorling needs this stuff now.
Yeah. But that's like
now. Thanks, Angelo.
I'll take the heat for that.
Yeah. But as Angelo's saying, I mean, and I was listening to you. It's you're talking about the trainer. In a training situation, did the trainer handle the situation? That's a people skills thing. How you manage, if you're the trainer, how you manage the group and the emotions of the group that are in there and the individuals, and that's it's tied to that, and that's. And, in our assessments now, and just how we should be conducting ourselves. But I mean, that's a piece of it too, as you're saying, figure out how to, for us guys to be more empathetic in terms of understanding how the minority group, even if it isn't females, maybe it's something else that's the minority, that, snowboarders, just say because we have mixed groups. I mean, our CS events are mixed discipline. You might only have, say, there's a group of one snowboarder, that whether it's male or female is probably going to be the minority in that group. If you have 7 skiers and 1 snowboarder, so they're probably going to have a lot of the same things. And how do we manage that? So, yeah. I mean, Yeah. And so, I mean, is there some things from that are maybe, you know, not the low hanging fruit, like Angelo says, you know, the goggles, but are there some low hanging fruit or just some things people skills wise that are kind of high on the list that like all of us, and maybe even put it right to the guys? I don't mind. That's the stuff I'm trying to find out. Like, are there biases that I don't even know that I'm doing because of a guy when I'm training or doing things that I could do better for the women that are on my dev team or the women I'm just skiing with in the membership? I mean, what are some of the things that we need to do that we may be not doing well, people skills wise?
I don't know if I'm ready to answer that question.
Okay, well, hey, we got another podcast. We get Ann back on when she, but I mean, yeah, it's just, I think that's maybe a question we just, you know, could be a question for the future. You know, how do we, are there some big things, aren't there? You know, I mean, we kind of know that we don't want to have people skiing up behind while you're bucking your boots, doing that like that idiot did. But I mean, that, you know, are there little things? Are there things that we don't even know we're doing that we're not making somebody feel like part of the team?
I have a suggestion, and I wrote this into an article that was in 32 Degrees. One of the things that you have to do when you're, if you're making an effort to evaluate your own people skills, your own performance in that affective realm, you have to get help from the outside. Dunning-Kruger, you just cannot do that assessment on your own. So if you run a clinic and there's somebody you trust in there, someone you trust and somebody you're willing to hear hard feedback from, you have to ask them how you did, you know? And on not how hot your feet were, but like on the soft skills, that's a complete misnomer because they're so much harder than the technical skills, you know? But how did I do? And then be ready to hear something you may not want to hear. And then be ready to make effort to change it. That's the only way to do it. Because if we left to our own devices, we'll think we hit it out of the park every single time. That's human nature. You know, that just seems to be our psychology for whatever reason. But step one is asking how you did and then just be willing to hear the feedback, I think.
And even like, I agree with that totally. And even, you know, if you're thinking about inclusion or you're thinking about creating a comfortable space for any minoritized group in the clinic, specifically asking along those lines, hey, I'm really trying to improve my awareness in this way. Can you give me examples of times when I might, like, you know, make people feel uncomfortable or make you feel less welcome? And soliciting that and then genuinely listening. And I think when people are asked specifically at the beginning, they're more likely to share things that would otherwise be challenging or that they might not otherwise share, and they kind of have their eyes tuned to it. So that's actually a great tool.
So we talk a lot about role models, and I completely get when, you know, I'm a guy and I see 80 guys in a room and there's 10 women. It's pretty easy to have guy role models, but there's also a lot of women over the years that I've looked to as role models. I mean, Angelo will probably say the same thing. I mean, there's no way I know Angelo hasn't looked to Murmur as a role model. Lisa Siegel, Kathy Brennan, Sue Kramer. I mean, the list can go on and on. Pam Green, Christy Robertson. These are just people in the East I know. I mean, I can think way back to Gunstock and Marilyn Everett. She was a level 3 when my first year teaching, one of the trainers at Gunstock. I get, and maybe this is a stupid question. It's coming from a guy, but I mean, I have always looked either way. I mean, I've had enough guy role models, but I've looked at a lot of the women that I've had along the way. I mean, Kim Sievers was our director of education programs when I was first on the ed staff. So my first director when I went and taught skiing at Gunstock, the director was a woman. So maybe it comes from that. But do the women view guys and women different as role models? Do they look, is just because they don't see as many and like from your things, they need to see more people do those things to go, hey, I can do that? Or is it they do look for more role models as women?
One piece of role modeling that is specific is that a role model proves that it's possible. So like if a role model is like me, then I can see that as a possibility, which doesn't mean that I don't receive tons of mentorship and coaching and even, you know, what I would call great role modeling from men as well. It just means that when I see examples of people who are like me, then I I can see that as a pathway for my future potentially. Yeah. And personally, like I talk about this all the time when I'm skiing and I'm skiing with, say one of my male teammates. We're talking about something technical and they go and do something. I think, okay, I'm going to try to do it like that. And if I am training and skiing with one of my female teammates, and this is just my psychology, it might be unique to me. I think, oh, I'll be able to do that. Instead of try, it is, I will be able to do that. That will be possible for me. And it's just a mental shift. Yeah. And I think that is related to role models and them proving that it's possible because they're me. Yeah.
Lots of work to be done, but yeah, we'll see. I don't know, Angelo, I'm going to push. I'd love to see Ann out here for our snow sports management seminar, man, right there in front of all of them. Mm-hmm. Putting that out there. Cause one of my last questions is, has it sunk into you of how far this could go? Like after your sharing your information from your grad work and all that work and the response you've had, I imagine you've had a pretty big response, as you had said, even you didn't know it was being live streamed. So you were getting stuff on your phone. You're like, how do they know already? Cause but I mean, this had to have been response since then. I mean, just the stuff I've seen and heard and the way it's being pushed out, which it should, has it started to sink in the impact you have had and can have? And that was kind of, I think Angelo's kind of question, where does it go from here? But, is it sunk in at all yet?
It continues to sink in every day. I keep using the analogy that I was given this opportunity to give a keynote and I was very thoughtful about how I gave it. Mm-hmm. And I feel proud of how it turned out. And simultaneously in countries across the world, in the US, there had been so much groundwork laid, right? We have our Women's Advisory Council, formerly the Women's Initiative Task Force. They've been doing research. We have the Nancy Oakes Hall Scholarship. We have in Canada, they have an amazing mentorship program that has 70 people who are paired up in their organization. There are countries around the world that have been talking about this, working on it. And so it's like, yes, I lit a match for the keynote and I did it in a really specific way. But when I dropped it, it was a field of dry grass and people were ready for the information, ready to hear it. There had been enough momentum and enough thought that it sort of took off. So I see myself as kind of like a part of this journey and maybe an accelerator, but I didn't cause it. I just participated in the pathway. Does that make sense? And
yeah. And well,
that WhatsApp group that I created, that there's like the QR code in my presentation, has well over 100 people in it right now. There are already plans for meetings between different countries to talk about mentorship programs starting next week, actually. And it's like there's so much momentum already happening from it. And I've heard so much conversation about interski teams and representation and schools and how do we change those systems and how do we deal with these problems. And it has been fascinating to watch.
It was really great, Angela. And I know you want to get into it. It was cool to your presentation really put specific things together that I think individuals can do just as on their own, on their staffs, supervisors can do, companies, resorts can do. It wasn't lip service. It wasn't that we need more women. We need to do more. It was like, these are things that are happening. These are in the stories to know what people were thinking on both the male side, the female side, to understand how to get that people skills in there. It was really cool to me to finally get some nuts and bolts that were like, hey, here. And it wasn't difficult nuts and bolts. A lot of it. It was like, pretty much track what you're giving people on your staff. What are different people getting for lessons? Are they getting the same thing all the time? And it's always a 3-year-old down on the snow belt. It was really went to that. And then it really went to high level stuff of like, when the minority group is in a training situation. And like you said, the level, it was interesting to me to look at the snowboard and the alpine world, because the snowboard pie is so small. It's harder to get that group at that high end to be the same. I just thought it was really good, and I hope it continues, because it finally gives us something on both sides of the gender to figure out how to help and advocate. Because it definitely, confirmed me to keep advocating. Because there's something I can do when I see someone that needs to get some help, or just a push to go do it. But go ahead, Angelo.
I just want to say again that anybody who hasn't seen Anne's presentation could go to YouTube and type Anne Schorling, Schorling, and watch the presentation. It's terrific. And while you were talking, Dave, not that I wasn't listening, but at the very same time as I was multitasking, I typed in PSIA-AASI women in Google. Yeah. And I just looked at what came up, and Women of Winter Scholarship, Women's Summit, Women in Snow Sports, a bunch of videos, women to women. PSIA-AASI partners with Women of Winter to drive inclusivity, women's scholarships. Like, anybody who's listening, who's interested, any manager, any supervisor, any trainer, any instructor who feels slighted, any instructor who's worried about inclusion, it's that easy. Just go onto Google and type that in, PSIA-AASI women, see what comes up, and help make progress on your school. Like, it's that simple, and it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. I mean, we're pretty lucky, Angela, to have, Technica Blizzard's doing a ton on the women's side with the Women to Women program, and Leslie Baker Brown is pushing that hard and out there all across the world, working on stuff. They give some humongous scholarships for growth in that area, which is awesome.
Let's face it, we're also lucky the FAA hasn't shut us down by now. We're lucky on a lot of levels.
Hey, as they say in NASCAR, man, it's sometimes better to be lucky than good. So
I'll take that.
Yeah. But my last thing for Ann, I know Angelo always likes to, he has a few fun things or some things to kind of summarize.
I gotta say, that puts a lot of pressure on me, dude.
I do it every time too. I love doing that.
I just did my Google search. That was it. I'll think of something. Go ahead.
But and we'll see if Ann answers this one. So next year is the next tryout at the end of next season for the national teams. Will Ann Schorling be there?
I am currently planning to be there.
Cool. Awesome. Yep. Awesome. I love it. That's good. I was wondering. There you go, Angelo. Yeah, Angelo had a great time last year too. When he came back, even when he was out there skiing with you and the crew, he had a great time. He was sending me texts and talking afterwards. It was a great time.
No, we really did. And anybody who, if you have the opportunity to ski with Ann, take it, because it's just terrific. It's first class experience.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ann. And I hope we can have you on again, and would love to have you back. Hopefully before you make it on for your third term on the team. But even after that, we'd love to have you on. But maybe we'll be chatting, and in the fall, maybe we'll be out for Masters Academy.
Yeah.
That'd be cool. Bring the whole family again, like you did at Interski.
Yeah, right. That's another, you asked for future questions to talk about, thinking about how to support parents as they move through the organization. That's a good one.
Yeah.
In terms of motherhood, it's not the standard that needs to change. It's the logistics. I'm finding that on the development team right now. Our development and Cat A crew is, the women are creating families right now. So that's one of our,
the dudes are helping.
Yeah, the dudes are helping, but I don't know if they're going to help at home as much so the women can keep skiing. Let's keep the guys at home so the women can keep skiing.
I know some of those dudes.
Yeah, I know. So, but yeah, and thanks so much for coming on, taking the time. We definitely appreciate it, and enjoyed having you, and super good job over there. It was an awesome to listen and watch your presentation, and I think it's had great impact and will over the next few years, which is awesome to see.
Well, Dan, I don't know if folks at home can realize how proud Ann did the whole country, because at the closing ceremonies, when they were announcing the awards and the accolades, she was the highlight. It was a really, really big deal. It was pretty magical to see that. So good on you, Ann. Congrats. Thank you. It was
Thanks
awesome.
For having me on.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. This has been The Fall Line with KS and Company.